Hello and welcome to the Unpack, a video series by Unzip Media where we make sense of some of the most important stories in European tech. My name is Andrii Degeler. Now, over the past couple of weeks, my LinkedIn newsfeed has been full of European VCs and startup associations being really unhappy about the European Parliament. So I saw posts like this. But Europe risks European itself out of the opportunity. Or, unfortunately, the early signs from Brussels suggest the ambition is slipping. Ouch, Europe, you're killing momentum. But right now, the EU is about to get it wrong again. And it's so bad that literally everyone says it is a failed suggestion. Brain exploding emoji. So, what exactly has happened? The story begins with the idea of the so-called 28th regime, also known as EU Inc. And that is a movement that is supported and driven by the European startup ecosystem to create a standardized pan-European legal entity which will include the following. Let's see. One central EU-level registry, standardized investment documents, standardized EU-wide stock options, local taxes and local employment laws, and will be available for every founder within the European Union. So the idea of this has been around for a while, but this year it seems like it is finally getting enough traction in Brussels. It may, however, have stumbled at the very first step through the cogs of the European bureaucracy, or at the very least that is how many backers of the initiative from the startup community are seeing it now. Earlier this month, MEP Rene Repasi published a draft report of the European Parliament to the European Commission, which contains the recommendations on how to implement the 28th regime. This is the very first step, in fact, of the process that sort of signifies the beginning of the conversation around the idea. But, as I said at the top, the document made very many in the startup and VC circles quite frustrated. Now, the main point of contention is that, in the view of the critics, the proposal lacks ambition. In practice, it is reflected in the way that Repasi proposes to implement the 28th regime, namely, he wants to do it in the form of a directive rather than regulation. So let me explain you what the difference is rather quickly. If you want, you can always Google it yourself. So a regulation by the European Commission applies to all member states directly and automatically. There is no room for interpretation, and it does not go into national laws. It just basically imposed upon everyone. A directive, on the other hand, it can be seen as something that sets a certain goal, and then it has to be implemented into national laws of each member state. This latter process could create fragmentation across the European Union, and that is exactly, of course, what EU Inc. wants to avoid. And I agree that it is rather frustrating. In addition to this, the open letter that is signed by most, if not all, European startup associations, it outlines a bunch of other criticisms, and I really want to list them first, look at them together, and then we can discuss them one by one. Let's take a quick look. So, it is, first one, it is not a 28th regime in the strict sense, because the proposal relies on the Article 50 and 114 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, also known as TFEU, instead of Article 352. This is a mouthful, and this has very much to do with the same regulation versus directive debate, and we will mention it again in a bit. Second one, focus on saving outdated business models. The document focuses too much on things like dual-class shares and veto shares and asset locks and other ways that seem to mostly protect the mature, often family-owned businesses from, for instance, hostile acquisitions. Next one, overemphasis on killer acquisition and, together with this, preventing relocations. The proposal talks at length about the ways to protect startups from killer acquisitions by larger companies, and also to make sure that innovation that is funded by European public money does not move abroad. And the last one, the lack of startup voices. At the end of the draft proposal that was compiled by Repasi, there is a list of people and organizations that provided input for the document. So the issue taken by the Startup Association is that that list includes very few representatives of the startup community, but it has a whole lot of other different organizations that are not really coming from our industry. So, when I read all this, I really wanted to try and figure out what is actually going on, why the draft proposal has turned to be this way, and what will actually happen next. To get my answers, first of all, I had a lengthy phone conversation with Rene Repasi himself, so the MEP who actually wrote the draft proposal, and so he is what's called the rapporteur in the EU language. And we started the conversation that we had by addressing the biggest issue, which is why did he actually decide to go for a directive and not for the regulation?
It's not the first time that we do something like a 28 regime in EU law. We already have a somewhat European corporate form, ESSU, Societatis Europaea, which is the European listed company form, which got adopted in 2001. And the legal base used for this corporate form, and which would also have to be used for a regulation, would be the so-called Article 352 of the treaty. And this article requires a unanimity amongst member states in order to get adopted. And if you look at the SE was proposed in the 1970s. So it took 30 years to get unanimity done amongst member states. And in 2001, that was before the enlargement of the Eastern European member states. There was even less member states than nowadays. The second attempt to have a European corporate form, the European private company form, SPE, failed because it didn't meet the unanimity requirement. So therefore, designing something beautiful that is super beautiful on paper, but will never reach unanimity, so the vote that is needed to get adopted will not help anybody, on the contrary. So this maximum request will just, in my eyes, never see the light of earth. Even if it were to go there, let's propose it. Let's suppose we are able to make compromises amongst all member states. What is then happening? In reality, every member state thinks it's a great idea, but there is this very one national thing that is absolutely important because it's the most beautiful thing in the whole EU. Unfortunately, this argument is not in the same area of law, but is scattered in different areas. Germans think it's insolvency, French think it's labor, others think I don't know what. So we have a lot of beauties where compromises have to be made, and the end of it is a kind of Frankenstein monster where you make compromises everywhere, and then you have a regulation, but it looks like nothing. And it won't be accepted by the market operators since it doesn't need any coherence things or substance that the EU Inc. guys actually want to have. The most recent example of this is the so-called Pan-European Pension Product, PEPP. There we created a 28 regime for pension products, and it was such a beautiful political compromise that there is actually nobody except for one Czech fintech company that is making use of this and has sold 10,000 policies of this. And that was within a period of 10 years. So that makes it that what I want to propose is something that flies, and especially something that we do not have to make compromises on substance in order to actually achieve what they want to. And if you go for a form that allows for qualified majority voting in the council, much less compromises have to be made, since there are much less governments that we have to take on board. But if you go down that way, there's only one legal base that the treaties provide for. This is the Article 50, that's the specific legal base for adopting corporate law. And unfortunately, Article 50 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union provides for only one way of legislating, and that is a directive. Mm-hmm. That makes it that I propose rather dying in beauty, creating something nice, although we have to go a way around by making use of the legislative technique of a directive.
Okay, so this definitely explains the logic behind the draft proposal, at least why Repasi decided to do it this way. This explains why the directive was chosen, and it also explains the use of the Article 50 of the TFEU. However, I mean, doesn't the entire idea of a directive mean that we will actually end up with a patchwork implementation anyway, which is exactly what we want to avoid? Let's hear.
Yes, there is this is a risk that is inherent to directives, but there's a way of how we can address this. Namely, directives normally set minimum standards, and those minimum standards have then to be implemented, but member states can still play around in putting something on the top of it, so-called gold plating. And this is the main reason for legal fragmentation within the area of directives. But we have a possibility to address this. That's what we call maximum harmonization. Maximum harmonization means that whatever is written in the directive, member states have to implement one by one, word for word. There is no possibility to deviate it from it, neither upwards nor downwards. So they basically have to copy-paste the directive into national law. In that sense, it is the same rules everywhere, but they are now in the shape of a national law instead of a European law. And therefore, the only risk if you go for maximum harmonization directive is whether or not it is implemented. But when it is implemented, it is everywhere the same. Therefore, a full harmonizing or maximum harmonization directive is, let's call it, a shade of dark gray in comparison to a regulation.
Okay, so there we have our explanation in general, and I think everyone will have to decide for themselves whether it is a satisfactory one. But for now, let's move on to the rest of the questions raised in the open letter, because there is a bunch. Next up, the undue focus on killer acquisitions and structures like dual-class shares that mostly benefit mature family-owned kinds of businesses rather than innovative startups.
The elements on what I call long-termism in the report are optional. So nobody is forced to make use of these options, but I want to create these options. Since we know that there are certain scale-ups, for example, we have examples in Austria, that when they are growing quickly and fastly, they now create foundations, because only in the foundation structure they can scale up without risking to lose control over the idea. Mm-hmm. And currently, many investors go for equity. Once you are in the area of equity, then you purchase control rights. My understanding of venture capitalists is that they are actually not that much interested in control rights. They go for equity because it gives them the highest protection in case of insolvency, in order to manage the costs of failure. And for that, I do have understanding. And that's the reason why I then introduce other options that a corporate form can protect its equity, while, however, and that's the second element to it, I want to create an equity-like debt instrument that basically gives investors the same strength as equity in terms of insolvency protection, but is at the debt level so that it does actually comply with the needs of long-termism. Second, we see from other countries, Scandinavian countries in particular, let's take Denmark, that many large companies, or innovative companies like Danfoss and others, they are organized in steward ownership models, since they basically want to pursue the innovation not with the need to create short-term gain for shareholders, but long-term productivity. And at times, this is more what innovation needs. Yet, innovation comes in different shapes. And there's innovation that requires fast, short-term oriented growth, and that's fine. But there are other innovations that require more time and more protection, also against killer acquisitions, but not only. And I want to create just options that if founders consider their innovation to fall in that line of reasoning, that they can make use of those elements.
Okay, that's also understood. And in addition to this, Repasi also made an argument that currently only certain member states have things like dual-class shares or asset blocks that are defined in the law. And that could prevent companies to move freely within the EU if they require these provisions to be there. So in his view, enshrining these provisions in the 28th regime directive would actually solve this issue. Now, here comes the next point, preventing relocations. The wording, I have to say, really does not sound great at all. But before we jump into conclusions, let's just first see what the thinking behind this whole idea was like.
Yes, so this is a matter that was raised by also other political groups that basically wanted to create a European corporate form for the European Union. And not one that is used in order to make use of public money benefits, of public money support given by 27 member states in the European Union, and then thereafter taking all this money and moving into the United States or other third countries where then the benefits of a successful innovation can be collected. And this fear of exporting innovation that was creating in Europe was addressed. Moreover, since the idea behind this European corporate form is to create a status for European innovative companies, the thought was it should be also all European. And therefore, the idea was taken up, brought to my attention by other groups to include some sort of limitation on the possibility to leave the European Union. So it was to create a automatic and full free movement rights within the European Union, but indeed limited via third countries. Yet it's an idea that is not put in stone. It is an idea that is floated and is open for a discussion. And I think it would be here extremely helpful to also receive the feedback why there is a need, if we have a European innovative company form, to actually still have the back door open to leave Europe in this company form.
Okay, I guess this explanation is quite clear, and if you ask me, this is an absolutely terrible idea, really. So here I actually personally fully agree with the critiques raised by EU Inc. and the European Startup Associations. Like really, locking companies in is not a strategy. It goes against the very spirit of the startup community, and I really, really do hope that this part gets dropped before the proposal reaches the Commission. But this brings us to the final point of the contention, which is that startup community allegedly did not have an opportunity to voice its concerns, while other parties were consulted extensively during the draft proposal preparation stage. So this one appears to be somewhat overblown, and let me show you what I mean by that.
Since I am a member of the European Parliament, I have a policy of full openness and transparency. When I started in 2002, that was before Qatargate, there was no obligation to publish anything. And I published every single person that has contact with me, be it that they took up contact, be it that I actually reached out for them, so that everybody and anybody can see who tried to influence me and can then later assess on the basis of what I wrote whether this influence was exerted, and then can question me whether anything else in the paper was there, whether I had dinner or something else, which I also all make transparent. Therefore, there's also a list of personal meetings that I had, of dinners that I had, and everything. So I go for full transparency. And this full transparency approach is now held against me. So I was meeting with the Danish permanent representation because there is a Danish presidency. I was meeting with the German permanent representation because I am a German MEP. I met with the Polish permanent representatives because there was a Polish council presidency. I met with EU Inc. multiple times. It is mentioned under my personal meetings. And then there's the other list. And if you look already at the title of the so-called legislative footprint, it is input received. It's in passive form. I cannot control who sends me emails. And since there are 27 notary organizations, there were, of course, a lot of notary organizations sending me their papers. There are not so many startup associations. So in comparison to business organizations and others that were sending me emails with their input papers, there were just less startups that were sending me, interacting with me. So in that sense, it actually points back to them that they were obviously also not so much interested in sending me any input papers or input that they wanted to give, since otherwise they would have been on this list. So this list is only a comprehensive enlisting of everybody who got in touch with me, but it is not that I select in this list who was actually influencing me with their input. And the best example is, if you look into my draft report, the part on creation of the corporate form, all digital, only once within 48 hours. I can tell you, notaries hate me. Yet, there are many notary organizations on this particular list. So to claim that notaries had any influence on this report is, if you look in the substance, let's say, I would call it rather stretched.
So here I do believe that there was a misunderstanding, and it really does not seem like Repasi was actively deciding to take more input from established traditional businesses or, for example, notaries than from the startup ecosystem. And now, indeed, it is on the said ecosystem to provide more feedback and maintain a constructive conversation about the future of this whole project. Now, I am a tech journalist, but I'm obviously not a policy expert, and my knowledge of how things are done in Brussels is rather limited, which is why I really wanted to talk to someone who is closer to action. And fortunately, I managed to get hold of Maximilian Henning, tech reporter at Directive, who covered this story quite recently. So, Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and of course.
So can you very quickly for the audience tell a little bit about yourself, so what it is that you do and what's your work like these days?
Sure, I'm a tech reporter at Euractiv, which is an EU policy outlet based in Brussels, so we exclusively report on EU policy. I do tech focused on the digital single market, AI, startups, and cybersecurity.
Right. And so have you been following this entire 28th regime debate lately?
I have been following the debate basically since the start, I think. There were basically still before the actual start, but what there has been so far, I've been following pretty intensely, I would say.
Right. So before this week, what were you thinking about it? What was your take on the likelihood of this actually happening?
Well, the likelihood of something happening, I would say, is pretty big because the EU Commission has committed publicly already a year ago to a project in some way, shape or form. The really big question is, in what way will we see this project? Because like last year already, Commission President von der Leyen put it into her political guidelines, and usually the stuff that goes in there, we at least see some sort of actual proposal. The big question is, how will it look like? And then will it actually go through the whole process, or will it get stuck at some point?
Right. So and so what was your what did you think? Did you expect that it would go this way? Did you not expect to see a regulation at all?
It's an interesting question because usually the parliament goes for the most extreme option. Usually the parliament is always the one, so you kind of have like a sliding scale where the commission kind of goes for something in the middle of the possible approaches. The council wants to preserve as much of its power as possible, and the parliament goes for the most integration and most ambition possible. And in this case, we didn't really see that. We saw the parliament going for not the most ambitious option, definitely. And now the question kind of is, well, would it have been good for them to go for the really ambitious option, or is it better to go for an option that has a much better chance of getting adopted? That's a call you have to make kind of for yourselves.
But do you generally do you generally buy the argument that a directive has a much bigger chance of being adopted eventually?
That definitely. So that, I think, is not in question. I think everyone here in Brussels would agree that directives are much more likely to get adopted. Then the big question is, if we go for a directive, do we have, will it fulfill the aim we're going for? Because it's definitely true that in the council, the member states don't like regulations as much because it means giving more power away. So that is basically not in dispute. And then in this case, it is true that directives usually have the problem that it leaves a lot of leeway to the member states, and they can, in many cases, that can kind of destroy the purpose of harmonization because we still see a lot of differences, and that doesn't really make sense then anymore. But in this case, it goes for a specific kind of directive that does put still a lot of pressure on the member states to harmonize stuff actually, and not to just have, you have this area kind of to move around in, and then you still have these lots of differences. But how that actually will play out in practice will depend on the actual proposal, and then also how it is actually implemented. So it's kind of hard to answer work.
Mm-hmm. I see. Interesting. And so there were some other issues, of course, that the startup organizations who signed the open letter were not happy with. So what do you think of those?
I will focus on one other issue that I think is quite central, which is the central registry, because I think that is really a central part of this whole proposal. If we don't have like a central database for these EU companies in some way, shape or form, then, I mean, what are we doing? And that was found, at least in some version, in the Parliament proposal. So even though we have this big disagreement over regulation and directive, I would still say some of the central ideas of this ambitious startup community-led proposal were still found in this Parliament proposal. So the really interesting part is now the Commission proposal that we still have to wait for. What we're currently debating is basically the pre-stage of one of the three texts that will be put together into a coherent proposal at the end. And out of those, the Commission proposal will really set the tone, and the discussions for that are still ongoing. So that's the part that I'm really waiting for, and that will be expected, and that part is expected for the beginning of next year.
I see. Now, Maximilian, thank you so much for joining the show. Thank you so much for taking the time and answering all the questions. So where can we follow your coverage? Where can everyone find you and follow you and see your work?
Well, thank you very much for having me and for allowing me to share the little insight I have on the EU policy process. And you can find me on the Euractiv site. Maximilian Henning is my name, or on LinkedIn or on Blue Sky.
Perfect. Sounds great. Thank you so much once again for taking the time, and good luck.
Of course. Thanks, and same to you.
Now, before we leave, let us take a quick look at what is going to happen next and what you can and perhaps should do if you feel strongly about the future of the EU Inc. initiative. First of all, the Parliament proposal, the one that we have been discussing today. MEP Repasi keeps working on it by taking amendments from both his own parliamentary committee and also feedback from the industry, so from you and me and everybody else. The document will go through a committee vote in November, and then there will be a plenary vote in December, so the Parliament will vote for it. The version adopted at that latest vote by the Parliament will be then presented to the Commission. At the same time, the Commission itself is holding a public consultation regarding the initiative that will be live until September 30. In practice, this means that there is a questionnaire on the Commission website that anyone can fill out to express their views on the initiative. So, as I said, if you really feel strongly about this one, please go and participate in this consultation. I definitely will do that after I'm done here, and I will leave the link in the show notes. So after the Commission receives both the public feedback and the proposal from the Parliament, it will put together and adopt the ultimate proposal of its own. And the timeline for that is currently set to March 2026. After that happens, there is also a bunch of back and forth between the European Parliament and the European Council, which essentially will have to agree between themselves on all the details. This part, unfortunately, can take anywhere from a few months to a few years, and there is no time cap. But eventually, when that is done, then the proposal becomes law. If it is a regulation, then it will be applicable across the European Union from the moment it enters into force. If it is a directive, it will require the Parliament to set an implementation period. So MEP Repasi argues that a maximum harmonization directive will not require anything tricky in terms of implementation, so this period could be set to 1 year or even 6 months. So theoretically, if we look at that, we might see the 28th regime becoming reality somewhere in 2027. But I would say that 2028 actually looks significantly more realistic at this point. For now, let's keep an eye on this one and try to be constructive in our judgments and opinions. Now, this is all for this first episode of the Unpack. Please do like and subscribe if you find it interesting, and let me know what you think in the comments below, or send me an email to andrii@unzip.media. My name is Andrii Degeler, this was the Unpack, and I'll see you next time.